Hello, BookTube. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Nathan, and welcome to my channel. This is going to be a mostly spoiler-free review for The Secret History of Twin Peaks, which is written by Mark Frost and published by Flatiron Books in 2016. So, I'm saying it's going to be a mostly spoiler-free review. There's going to be light spoilers, essentially, and a fair bit of a discussion as well with this. So, to give you a quick rundown, I've been going through Twin Peaks again, so I rewatched the original series, the first two seasons of the series. I rewatched that, and then I read Twin Peaks, the Secret History of Twin Peaks by Mark Frost, and this came out just before the third season or the limited event series of Twin Peaks, the season 3, whatever you want to call it, before this came out, because that's essentially the order. This was published in the fall of 2016, and then I believe this came out in the spring of 2017, and I have not got there yet. But there's the follow-up book to this, also by Mark Frost, called The Final Dossier, Twin Peaks: The Final Dossier, also published by Flatiron Books, and I believe this came out in the fall of 2017. So I've not read this yet. It's a fair bit shorter than The Secret History of Twin Peaks, and if you're comparing the two, it's a fair bit shorter. So we'll see. Now, I'll say... if you feel that you absolutely need to read this in order to understand the Twin Peaks universe, I can tell you really don't. It's a nice little additional piece to the series, but even with that being said, and I'm going to get right into it, it doesn't add much to the history, and even calling it The Secret History of Twin Peaks, I don't know if that entirely makes sense. I would say it's probably closer to some alternate history to Twin Peaks. Some of it fits right in, but there's some stuff, some canonical storylines from seasons 1 and 2, as in, we know this is what happened in seasons 1 and 2, and then this gives us a different version of it, and I'm not quite sure why that is. And I've done a little bit of research, not a lot. I've been told that some fans were upset by this, and then Mark Frost and David Lynch, I think it was Mark Frost who said that it will make sense in season 3, but at least at this point it doesn't seem to make sense. And so I guess I might as well name those instances. So for one thing, the whole story, and this is where I'm saying, like, it's sort of spoiler-ish, but not really, because this doesn't spoil the book itself, that you get a little, like, the story between Ed and Norma and Nadine, that whole love story, that is completely altered. The way Nadine loses her eye, how Ed and Norma initially break up, how he and Nadine get together, that's just changed, and I don't see it being changed for the better. I don't quite get the reason for that. And I know that there's a couple other things that happened in this as well that didn't really make sense, that we saw something different in the show. And like, for instance, you have Ben Horne, where you've got this footnote in here where it says that Ben Horne did surrender and he found his way back to health. This is where he's going through, he is having essentially a psychotic episode, and he's caught up in reenacting the Civil War, and he essentially wants the South to win to change history, essentially. And then in this, The Secret History of Twin Peaks, then it says that he surrenders, but in the show he doesn't. Then in the show, then he plays it out so that way the South wins and the Union surrenders. I don't quite know what to make of that, whether this is just... And it can't be an error. I can't believe that Mark Frost, with the show that he co-created, didn't remember the original storylines, and he didn't rewatch the first couple seasons, which wouldn't take that long, like a few days at most, if like that's all you were doing. It wouldn't take all that long to get through it, that he just forgot. But I also don't see what the intention here is, so I'm not quite sure what to do with it. Overall, and this is what I would say about the book, it could be considered, some will consider this to be a more difficult text to read. It's not particularly difficult. To be honest, it's not nearly as complex as you might think. Once you understand how to approach the book, then it's very comprehensible. It makes perfect sense once you start reading it. If you're familiar with academic writing at all, and in particular in the social sciences, then it makes perfect sense. Basically, all that you have is you've got a series of narrators in this book. Imagine it this way. One way to consider this would be found fiction, right? That's the term that I like for this. So if you're familiar with the horror genre, then you know within horror cinema, then you have the found footage genre of, oh, we were just out in the woods and then we found these videotapes. Like, really it was popularized with the Blair Witch Project in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And then that kind of, it took a few years, but then that whole found footage genre took off. Imagine this as found fiction. And I think found footage works best in the horror genre. And I think that found fiction also works best in the horror genre. But this book is not really horror. And I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm not quite sure what Mark Frost is going for by the end of it, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. It seems unclear of what his purpose is, but let's call it found fiction for now. So as a piece of found fiction, it is a collection of documents that this FBI agent, and she is unnamed, or he, I'm sorry, I'm spoiling things. In any case, she is unnamed at the beginning of this. And so you find out at the end what her actual name is. It doesn't really spoil anything because we don't know who she is until the end of the book. But it's not like she's a named character from the original series or anything like that. So she has been given all of these documents, and they've been collected together by not just one person, but by a group of people over quite a long period of time, decades and decades and decades. It was this original archivist who was keeping track of all of these documents and collecting them and making little notes in the margins. And so the notes in the margins are little footnotes. And it really is as simple as that. You basically read until you hit a footnote, and then you go and read the footnote, and then you come back to the text. It's honestly not difficult to follow. Where it gets a little bit difficult to follow, or a little bit more complicated, is that you have multiple people writing in the margins. It's not just the original archivist or archivist who is making notes in the margins. It's the person he passes it on to, and then the next person. And so ultimately, you've sort of got a series of narrators within the book, all to some degree commenting on the previous person's notes. And now we've got the new person, this FBI agent, who's going through all of these documents, looking at it. So the text itself, like I say, is not particularly complicated to follow, but it's not a traditional structure or format to a novel. It's, unconventional, but not particularly difficult to follow. Now, I want to talk about the actual structure to it, but let me just finish up with the story first. So, as far as what we're getting in this, it is the history of Twin Peaks, and to some degree it is the secret history of Twin Peaks. And it goes all the way back to the early explorations of Lewis and Clark, going across to the Pacific North Coast, or like to the Pacific Northwest. And you get the stories of the Native Americans, the First Nations people through there. You find out that there's something up with this whole area around Twin Peaks, right? So, okay, we've kind of had some sense of that from watching the show. Then you kind of follow this through, and I'm not spoiling too much here by saying this, but then you get into some other strange phenomena outside of Twin Peaks that all kind of comes back to Twin Peaks itself being a significant place on Earth or a significant space on Earth, but it's not the only significant space on Earth. Okay, that there's other similar places to this, but strange events. And again, I don't think that this is too spoiler-ish to say a lot of the history of UFOs is connected into this, and Frost is trying to weave together different elements of conspiracy theories and trying to blend them all together, where he's mixing historical fact with some fiction. And I'm trying to take a fairly critical eye to this. He's not doing a particularly great job of it. It's not poorly done, but I would say that it's not skillfully executed. It's not the best instance that I've seen of this. And I talked about this before in my review for the Dan Simmons novel, The Terror. He does a really interesting job of blending things, or even, and Simmons has done that in other books as well. And so it's a little disappointing to look at this. As far as the actual characters, the ones from the town, and you're saying, but I want to know what happened with all these different characters from all of the years between the seasons 1 and 2 to season 3. And again, not trying to spoil too much, you don't really get anything. You get very, very little about these characters. And I imagine that if you just never heard of this book and you never read it, I imagine that you would be able to watch seasons 1 and 2 and then watch season 3, and somebody who's already read the book would not really have a whole lot more wouldn't have much more insight into the series, which is kind of disappointing. It's kind of disappointing considering that this is, something like 360 pages of text, and it doesn't really add much to the story. And so I'm not quite sure what the purpose was with this. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be giving us just more background information on the town of Twin Peaks and kind of the history of it, but it doesn't really affect our main characters all that much. You have a little bit in terms of the significance of the trees, of the wood, like the actual timber itself and how important timber is to the town of Twin Peaks, and that the trees themselves have got a fair bit of significance. As you read this, then you do get into that history, and it does inform some of the dialogue from seasons 1 and 2, like when Dale Cooper initially arrives in town and he, is just captivated by the trees. Okay, it makes sense that there is something more to the trees. There's something more to the owls, and you do get a little bit of that. But there's not enough to me to justify a book of this length. Now, it's not bad. It's not poorly written. It's not really, really skillfully written, because like I say, I don't really know what his purpose is. I think that, and this is what I had said earlier, I think that found fiction works best in the horror genre. Just like found footage, if you think about this, you could make a found footage film in any genre. You could make a found footage comedy. You could make a found footage romance. You could make a found footage sci-fi movie, or, potentially, it'd be strange, but a found footage fantasy series, maybe urban fantasy, it would work. But in any case, my point here is we don't even really think about found fiction working in those genres. We just think found fiction is automatically horror. Found footage is automatically horror. And so in this case, then I look at it and I'm like, okay, if this is not an overt horror novel, and if these things don't really connect all that well together, then what's the purpose of this? So this is where I want to talk about the actual structure of the text. So the actual structure of the text, I think some people would consider this to be ergodic literature. So ergodic literature is a theoretical concept. It's like a literary theory, a theory, and then we're applying it to literature. So it's a way of interpreting it or viewing it, just having a certain perspective on it. And essentially what it means, and I'm simplifying it because I'm not an expert by any means on ergodic literature. I've read some, but not a lot. And essentially what it means is that there's non-ergodic literature and then ergodic literature. So let me explain non-ergodic literature. Non-ergodic literature just means that it is immediately apparent how to read the text from beginning to end. That it's just your eyes are moving across the page and you're going from one line to the next, to the next, to the next, and the pages go in a certain order, and you don't need any instructions on how to read the text. You wouldn't read it any other way. It's immediately apparent. This is how you read the book. You start at the beginning, you start at the first line, and then you read all of the lines in that sequence until you get to the very end, and the entire story will make sense. Ergodic literature, however, is more complex. Ergodic literature says it's not really clear how to read this. What order do you read this in? Do you start at the beginning? And so this is where I'm saying, if you're looking at like the footnotes and the pictures that you have, then you're saying, well, which footnote do I read to the end of the page? Do I read to the end of the chapter and then go back and look at the footnotes? Do I look at the picture first, or do I look at the footnote before looking at the picture? And because it's a series of documents that have all been collected together, how do I even approach this? Well, this is where I'm saying that some people might consider this to be ergodic literature, and I think it's Mark Frost trying to write ergodic literature where it's not entirely clear how the reader is supposed to approach this, or we're supposed to say like, ooh, this is a strange, complex book. How do I even read this? And then the way we read it can be different from one reading to another. So the first time we read it, we might read it a certain way in a certain order, and reading this part of the text first and then that part, and you're flipping the book around, looking at an image this way and then looking at it that way, just trying to puzzle your way through it, and then ultimately that's where the meaning is coming from. But ultimately what ergodic literature does is it opens up possibilities for you to be able to read the same text a second time and get a different meaning by reading it a different way. Ergodic literature is often like in terms of like the digital humanities and like cyber texts, then it may even be a computer program. And so a narrative being told through a computer program where the order of it might be different. So an example of this that I have read is Patchwork Girl. And you can do a quick search on that, but Patchwork Girl is like an early electronic text where the order in which you read it, like you're just clicking on different parts of the story, and there's no instructions on this is chapter 1, this is chapter 2, this is chapter 3, this is chapter 4. So you're getting a different order to the story all the time when you read it, when you reread it, and you never really know when you're done. Right? So it's fairly complex. That's why I'm saying there's non-ergodic literature where it's very obvious how to read the story. Ergodic literature gets a little more complex, and you get different meanings that come out of this. This is my point, is that I think he's trying to do this, but I don't think that's what happened. I think it's a pretty conventional order. As soon as you understand, it's essentially read it the way you would read an academic text, where you read the body of it, you hit a footnote, and you should read all of the footnotes in this. In some academic texts, you might not necessarily do that. But in this, then just read all of the footnotes once you get to the number, and then you just return to the body of the text, and that's it. But ultimately, I don't see the purpose to this. This isn't all pulling us into one big narrative. It's not really tying it all together. It's kind of ergodic literature in that you could, I guess, read this out of order in a different sequence, where you could say, I don't really care about the history of Twin Peaks. I just want to know about the characters themselves, and just skip to those sections. But even then the sections that we do have with characters from the original series, from the first 2 seasons of it, then their stories are different. So then you're saying, now why are they different? Is this supposed to be making me question the archivist from this, the collector of all of these documents who put this together, that I should say, well, maybe they're lying to whoever else, or maybe the FBI is now relying on false information, but they're weird things to change, like changing Ed and Norma's and Nadine's backstory, changing Jacoby's notes as far as what happened with Ben Horne, that one I kind of get because it does say they read through Jacoby's notes and it said that Ben Horne surrendered. And so maybe Jacoby wrote that down because he thought this is going to sound really messed up if one of my patients got cured by believing that the South won the Civil War and therefore slavery continued, like that he encouraged this in a patient. Maybe that's why the Ben Horne one changed, because it did mention Jacoby's notes. But the other one, I don't understand why it changed. It seems puzzling to me. And as far as the overall effect, what is he going for with this? I don't know. Here's some interesting stuff about Twin Peaks and a little bit more backstory about the town itself. But these things don't all pull together into a certain narrative. So then even having these different narrators over the years who are all making notes in the margins and kind of commenting on the previous notes, that didn't really all fit together towards one story. So, like I say, I'm a bit disappointed with it. It's not bad. I'm just not quite sure about the significance. I'm not sure about the importance of it and why Mark Frost felt compelled to write all of this. It doesn't fit very well together. And I do want to give a shout out here, and I'm not going to get too into the book, but if you're interested in this particular approach, like what you're getting in The Secret History of Twin Peaks, I encourage you to check out House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. If you have not read House of Leaves before, and especially if you like horror literature and you like complex books, this is a great example of ergodic literature. Some people will say it's not horror. Some people will say it's actually a love story, which is interesting. There are definitely horror elements, and I think much of the book is meant to unsettle you. This is the best example I've ever seen of found fiction. Most people would agree with me as far as it being ergodic literature and found fiction, and it is. I see it very much as a horror novel. It works so well. I studied this. I took a course on digital humanities when I was getting my master's in English, and I gave a whole long presentation on this. And so I took as many notes as I could, as many notes as I thought were interesting in The Secret History of Twin Peaks, and as many notes as I thought were interesting when I was thinking through House of Leaves. I don't know how well you can see the difference there, but like it's, in other words, there's really interesting complex stuff going on in House of Leaves. It's very satisfying. It is a rich, detailed book. It is unclear at times how exactly to approach the text, how to read the story. It really forces you, like it is challenging you as a reader to keep up and make sense of the story, but it has a really good payoff as a result of it, and it all fits together really well. You really understand by the end of it why all of this stuff was collected together as this piece of found fiction. That doesn't happen with The Secret History of Twin Peaks, which is, and believe me, I will say this, to say that this book doesn't hold up to House of Leaves is like, okay, there's not a lot of books I think that hold up to House of Leaves. I have a lot of respect for this book, and certainly as a piece of found fiction or ergodic literature. So to say that it doesn't meet that standard is maybe not a fair criticism. At the same time, my point is, if you really like the concept, but you're maybe and you want to see the best example of it, then read House of Leaves. If you are just a Twin Peaks fanatic and you just were unaware of this book and you're like, I don't care if it doesn't really all fit together, I don't care if it's not the best representation of found fiction ever, I just want to know any little bit about the characters from the Twin Peaks universe and to get a little bit more background on the series, then absolutely go for it and read it. Like, I'll say, I don't regret reading this. I still really enjoyed it. I was just disappointed because I guess I had higher expectations that this was all going to fit together, and it doesn't. It's kind of a loose collection of documents that you think, Ooh, and maybe because I've seen it done so well before with House of Leaves, that I'm like, it's all gonna come together. It's all gonna come together. And then it just doesn't. You're just like, oh, okay. It was still good. It was still interesting. All the little different storylines that you get with, like I say, extraterrestrials and, Lewis and Clark and a bunch of other stuff that's going on. The history of Twin Peaks, with like the early history of the founding of the town and the competing lumber mills and all of that stuff. And, the Martell family with the Horns and, the Packards and all of that. You do get into that and you kind of recognize some of the characters' names, especially the characters who are older from the original, from seasons 1 and 2. The older characters, you kind of recognize them and they make little appearances when they're younger and you go, oh, okay, that's cool. I kind of get how that fits in and ties in. So if you're a really big fan of Twin Peaks, I think there's enough in here to satisfy you. And even for me, like I say, I still enjoyed it. I don't regret reading it, but it wasn't quite as good as I was hoping for. And that's okay. That's okay. Not every single thing that I read has to always meet the standard up here. Like it's okay to read something and say, like I don't really believe in a star system, but let's say, like it was a 3 out of 5. Not everything has to be a 5 out of 5, and there can be good enough stuff in a text to still be satisfying while saying, I think there's ways that it could have maybe been better, but that's okay that it just didn't quite reach that level. So that's overall what I think about this, and I'm hoping that it's going to work better in the final dossier. I really, really do. I've still got really high hopes for this one, in part because it's shorter. So maybe, in part because it's shorter, then I'm thinking maybe Mark Frost is going to do a better job of pulling it all together in this, and also because it was written pretty close to the same period of time, if not at the same period of time, as he was working on Twin Peaks season 3 or The Return. So I've got higher hopes for this one, and especially with it being called the final dossier, then I'm like, is it going to tie into the events of the Twin Peaks universe from the TV series better, or at least more closely than this one does? Hopefully. But like I say, I have not actually watched season 3 yet, so I get to do that now. Now that I've read the book and I've made this video, so I get to actually watch this, and then once I watch this, I will make another podcast going over season 3, and then I get into the final dossier. All right, folks, well, feel free to comment below and like and share and all of that stuff. And if you've read it, what did you think of it? And if you haven't read it, if you've got questions or anything like that, then feel free to comment below. All right, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.